First at noon, that breaking news: a murder suspect is on the run in Daytona Beach after police say he killed someone in Alachua County and fled to Volusia.
Investigators say he abandoned his car and officers chased him on foot near the Main Street Pier before they lost him.
West 2 Volusia County reporter Pamela Cohn joins us live. Pamela, you just got an update from the chief.
Yeah, and he says to consider this man dangerous. If you see him, do not approach him and immediately call 911. The chief does say there is a possibility he might no longer be in Daytona Beach, but out of an abundance of caution, they are bringing in extra resources to patrol the area in case he is still within city limits. This is his photo. Take a look. This is 31-year-old Xavion Perry. Police say he was involved in a domestic shooting, a fatal shooting in Alachua County just before 10 p.m. on Tuesday. Through technology, investigators were able to track him down to Daytona Beach.
Q McRae here in Ormond Beach with some breaking news. Take a look. If you can see it, there are some Volusia County deputies out here on the shore, and they have a body, they say, that washed up on shore. A body they say they believe belongs to murder suspect Xavion Perry III. Now, if you know his story, we've been on top of it for about a day now. He's wanted for shooting someone in Gainesville. Then he got in his car, police say, and drove here to Central Florida. One of the Daytona Beach cop cruiser license plate readers noticed his car. They chased him to the pier down in Daytona Beach, which is about 30 minutes down ocean shore here. And they say that when he got to the pier, he ran up the pier. They chased him on foot, and at some point he jumped off the pier down to the sand about 20 feet below. Now, at the time, they thought he may have ran off and they couldn't find him. Well, now they believe that body that's out on the water right now, on the sand rather, belongs to him.
Police lights rip across the night sky over Daytona Beach. The Main Street Pier, normally a postcard for tourists, is crawling with officers and deputies, shoulders hunched against the ocean wind as they sweep every inch of wood and sand for one man. They've shut down sections of the boardwalk. Patrol cars idle along the Main Street Beach approach, engines humming, red and blue lights soaking the pier in color. Tourists, barefoot and sunburned, are pulled back behind makeshift cordons. Locals peek through condo windows, phones pressed to ears, listening to scanners and group chats. The warning is simple and chilling. A homicide suspect out of Gainesville, armed and dangerous. Last seen in all black with white socks and sneakers, somewhere on this strip of Florida coastline. Just minutes ago, officers say, he ran the length of this very pier, vaulted the railing, and hurled himself roughly 20 feet down onto the sand below. By the time they fought their way down to beach level, he was gone, swallowed by the dark, the surf, and the crowd noise. They know his name. They know his face. They know what he's accused of. Because a few hours earlier, 90 miles away at Creeks Edge Condos on Northwest 23rd Boulevard in Gainesville, police walked into a unit and found a young woman on the floor with a gunshot wound. She was 23 years old, a nursing student, just weeks away from graduating from the University of Florida with her BSN and stepping into the career she'd spent years building toward. Now, as officers chase his shadow along the Atlantic, their chief says that during his flight, this same man had gone live on social media, holding a gun on camera, talking about not wanting to survive the night. He didn't just run, he broadcast his panic, his defiance, and his collapse in real time. Her name was Brooke Elizabeth Smith. She was 23 years old, and this is her story. If stories like Brooke's matter to you, told with care, detail, and respect, tap subscribe now so more people see this case in their recommendations. Because to understand why a man is running along a Florida pier with a gun and a death wish, you have to start in a Gainesville apartment where a future nurse was supposed to be safe. Welcome to Behind Doors Crime. In today's case, we're walking through the story of a Florida nursing student on the edge of graduation, the boyfriend she was trying to leave, and the night that ended with a body on the coastline. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. It helps this story travel further than the headlines ever did. Now, let's get into it. Gainesville, Florida, is the kind of town where the academic calendar feels like the weather forecast. The year is divided into semesters, not seasons. Classes start, midterms hit, football weekends shut down entire streets, and then, twice a year, the city fills with caps and gowns as students cross the stage and move on. The University of Florida isn't just a campus. It's the engine that sets the rhythm for everything around it. Apartments rise and fall on student leases. Cafes open early for exam weeks. Entire lives are built around that one moment where a name is called, a degree is handed over, and the next chapter begins. On the northwest side of the city, tucked off Northwest 23rd Boulevard, sits Creeks Edge Condominiums. It's the kind of place you'd expect to find students and young professionals. Clusters of buildings, parking lots full of compact cars and old sedans, balconies strung with lights, and front doors held open by backpacks when people are juggling books and coffee. For most residents, it's a temporary stop, 4 walls to sleep, study, and dream behind until it's time to go somewhere bigger. One of those residents was Brooke Elizabeth Smith. By the time this story begins, Brooke is in the final stretch of her Bachelor of Science in Nursing at the University of Florida. Some articles will later call her 23, some 24, but what matters is where she stood. At the edge of a finish line she had been running toward for years. Nursing school isn't a casual degree. It's clinical hours at hospitals and clinics, early mornings in scrubs, late nights hunched over textbooks and practice exams, and a constant pressure to be ready for people on their worst day. Brooke was doing all of that, balancing rotations, exam prep, and the 1,000 tiny tasks that come with trying to hold your life together while you prepare to take care of everyone else's. People who knew her talk about her, in the way you talk about someone you expected to outlive you. They describe her as hard-working and kind, the quiet kind of steady that makes group projects easier, and clinical shifts feel less overwhelming. Faculty remember her as focused, reliable. Friends remember the way she talked about August, the month circled in her mind when she would finally walk across a stage in a UF gown, hear her name over the speakers, and officially become a nurse. All the late nights, the missed parties, the early alarms, they weren't abstract sacrifices, they were investments. Every decision she made, from the jobs she took to the people she spent time with, was filtered through one question. Does this get me closer to graduation? In the middle of that life, between classes and clinicals and shifts, she met a man named Xavion Perry III. Xavion was 31. Police and reporters would later identify him as her boyfriend. Some say estranged partner by the time everything fell apart. Before his name became part of a headline, he was a person with a history and a family. Relatives and friends describe him as full of life, not the type to fade into the background. He was the kind of presence that fills a room when he walks in, for better and for worse. People loved him, and those people will grieve him too. That's important to remember, because cases like this have a way of flattening everyone into one moment. But there is another record of who he was, and that record doesn't come from memories, it comes from the courts. At a press conference later, Daytona Beach's police chief would stand in front of cameras and list the charges attached to Xavion's name.
The suspect has been identified as 31-year-old Xavion Perry. His date of birth is October 5th of 1994. Perry is described as a black male, approximately 6 feet 1 inch tall, with thin to medium build. Perry has a criminal history that includes 1 felony charge for grand theft and 2 misdemeanor charges involving domestic violence and resisting without violence. At this time, there's been 0 convictions.
1 felony grand theft charge, misdemeanor charges involving domestic violence, a charge for resisting an officer without violence. On paper, there were already warnings. Situations serious enough that law enforcement had been involved, even if they hadn't yet led to convictions. They were lines in a file somewhere, filed away long before Brooke's name ever appeared in a report. Somewhere between that file and the hallways of the University of Florida, Brooke and Xavion's lives intersected. They entered into a romantic relationship, one authorities would later describe as domestic in nature. From the outside, it looked like countless other couples in college towns everywhere. Photos, shared spaces, overlapping routines. You might see them in the parking lot, in the hallway, walking out to the car. You might assume you knew the story just from the surface. But the truth is, we don't have a day-by-day log of how that relationship shifted. We don't know every argument, every apology, every promise to do better, every quiet morning when nothing seemed wrong at all. Most of what passed between Brooke and Xavion stayed where most relationship history lives. Behind closed doors, in text threads, in memories only 2 people can fully decode. By the time the public learns anything about them, one of them is gone and the other is being described primarily in terms of a crime. What we do have is this. In the days leading up to May 26, investigators say Brooke was trying to end the relationship, or at least create distance from Xavion. She was, by their account, pulling back. Maybe that meant fewer calls answered, fewer visits, a conversation at her kitchen table that didn't go the way he wanted. Maybe it meant setting boundaries that had been missing before. The details are hazy, the pattern is not. Because from the point of view of a counselor, a friend, or a hotline advocate, what Brooke was doing is exactly what they would tell her to do. Step away from something that feels unsafe, protect herself, focus on her future. On paper, it is the healthiest move she could make. In the lived reality of an abusive or controlling partner, that same move is the one that brings all the hidden pressure to the surface. All of Brooke's sacrifices, her late nights, her early mornings, the years she'd poured into becoming a nurse, were leading toward a single moment in August when she would cross a stage and finally exhale. She was walking toward that future and away from a relationship she no longer wanted to carry. On paper, she was just setting a boundary, making a choice every counselor would applaud. But in the world of controlling partners, that moment isn't an exit. It's a trigger. If you think more people need to see how these danger signs show up long before they become headlines, hit like so, this story gets pushed in front of someone who might need to hear it. There's a moment in some relationships that experts talk about in quiet, serious tones. It's not the first argument, not the first slammed door, not even the worst bruise. It's the moment someone decides they're done. Not in a dramatic offhand way, but in the way that leads to packing a bag, blocking a number, changing a lock, or just quietly stepping back and saying, "This can't continue." Decades of domestic violence research and law enforcement experience point to that moment as the most dangerous one of all. Not the early days, not the everyday tension, but the window where a victim is trying to leave or reduce contact. That's when the person who has been in control feels that control slipping. And for some, that loss of control feels worse than any consequence they might face for what they're about to do. Advocates see it over and over again. They get the calls at 2 in the morning from people whispering in closets, asking how to leave safely. They warn that the time around separation, the planning, the confrontation, the first days apart, isn't just emotionally hard. It's statistically lethal. Police see it in reports that escalate from arguments and threats to restraining orders, and too often to homicides. The pattern isn't subtle. When a controlling partner senses that they are being shut out, cut off, or finally told no, the risk of serious harm spikes. The logic is cruel but simple. Violence in these situations isn't just about anger. It's about ownership, about the belief that the other person is an extension of you rather than a person with their own life and choices. When that illusion cracks, when the victim starts pulling away, the person who's been clinging to that sense of ownership can react in ways that are as desperate as they are deadly. That's why hotlines and counselors don't just say, "Leave." They say, "Leave with a plan," because they know this is the point where things can turn fatal. Brooke Elizabeth Smith was standing in that window. Gainesville police would later describe what happened to her as domestic in nature. They would say in careful, measured language that she had been attempting to end or step back from her relationship with Xavion Perry. She was doing what every resource, every safety brochure, every well-meaning friend would tell her to do: create distance from something that felt wrong and focus on the life she had worked so hard to build. On paper, it was the right move. In reality, it meant she was walking straight through the most dangerous stretch of an already dangerous road. Brooke was in that danger window, and she didn't know how narrow it really was. On Tuesday night, May 26, Gainesville moved through its usual routines. Classes were over for the day. A humid darkness settled over Northwest 23rd Boulevard. Inside Creeks Edge Condominiums, lights flicked on and off as people cooked dinner, scrolled their phones, or fell asleep with laptops still open on final projects. From the outside, nothing about the complex suggested that one of its units was about to become the center of a crime scene. Inside that unit, Brooke was at home. This was the same space where she'd come back from clinicals and drop her bag on the floor, where she'd drink coffee over textbooks, where she'd count down the weeks to graduation. It was supposed to be the safest place in her life, a buffer between her and everything she had to push through to get that nursing degree. Sometime just before 10 o'clock that night, that illusion shattered. Neighbors later told reporters they heard what sounded like multiple gunshots coming from one of the apartments. For some, it was just a sharp interruption in the soundscape of televisions and dishwashers. For others, it was enough to make them freeze in place, listening to see if it was fireworks, a car backfiring, or something worse. When the sounds didn't repeat and no one saw anything obvious outside, the next move was the one that changes everything. Someone picked up a phone and called for help. Shortly before 10 p.m., Officers from the Gainesville Police Department were dispatched to Creeks Edge for a shots-fired call. They drove the same route countless patrol cars have driven for noise complaints, parking disputes, and welfare checks. But this time, they arrived with the knowledge that someone inside had heard gunfire, and they didn't know yet who or what they were walking into. They pulled into the lot on Northwest 23rd Boulevard, stepped out under the sodium lights, and made their way up to the caller's building. Apartment doors that had been just part of the scenery a few minutes earlier now felt like thresholds to something they couldn't see. They followed the sound of their own radios, the smell of the night air, the subtle cues that come from years of walking down hallways where each door could be the last one you open. At Brooke's unit, they knocked, announced themselves, and went inside. What they found there has been summarized in a single sentence in most news reports. Brooke Elizabeth Smith, suffering from at least one gunshot wound. The details behind that sentence, the echo of the shot, the way she fell, the silence after, never make it past the walls of that apartment. What's known publicly is that officers and emergency responders tried to save her, but their efforts weren't enough. Brooke was pronounced dead at the scene. Local discussion online would later say she had been shot multiple times, sometimes specifying 3 shots. Those numbers circulate in comment sections and community threads, but they sit apart from official statements. What the record confirms is that she was shot, that the wound or wounds were fatal, and that by the time the call reached the outside world, there was no way to bring her back. In the first minutes after a scene like that, officers do 2 things at once. They secure the space in front of them, and they start reaching outward. Who lives here? Who has keys? Who was supposed to be here tonight? Who's missing? The answers to those questions in this case pointed to one name. Within a short window of time, police identified 31-year-old Xavion Perry as the suspect. This wasn't a stranger breaking in from the outside. It wasn't a random act of violence by someone who would never be connected to Brooke again. This was someone who had been in her life, someone with a documented history, someone whose relationship with her had been described as romantic and domestic. And now, as officers stood in her living room marking evidence, he was no longer there. From the very beginning, investigators framed this as a domestic homicide. They didn't stand in front of microphones and talk about a mysterious intruder or a crime opportunity. They said it plainly. This was about a relationship, about a man and a woman whose lives had been intertwined, and about a line that had been crossed with a gun. For Brooke, this is where her story inside that apartment ends. A future nurse, only 23 years old, spends her last ordinary Tuesday inside the home she'd built while grinding through nursing school, only to have it transformed into a scene lit by camera flashes and evidence markers. A place that once held textbooks and coffee cups now holds detectives and crime scene tape. While detectives were still documenting Brooke's living room as a crime scene in Gainesville, Xavion had already put miles of highway and a strip of Florida coastline between himself and the life he'd just destroyed. By the time Brooke's apartment in Gainesville had been marked off with crime scene tape, the night was already carrying her story east. From Gainesville, the road to Daytona Beach is a long dark ribbon of highway cutting through central Florida, past gas stations and exits that blur together when you're driving faster than you should. It's just over an hour if you take it straight, enough time for the adrenaline to cool into panic, and for panic to harden into whatever comes next. Somewhere along that route, under a sky that looks the same no matter what you've just done, a black Dodge Charger pushed toward the coast. While Gainesville officers were still taking statements and logging evidence, an alert pinged in another part of the state. Just after 11:30 that night, law enforcement technology flagged that same Charger in the Daytona Beach area. A car tied to a homicide in Alachua County had just crossed into the jurisdiction of a very different police department in a city known more for its beaches and races than for late-night manhunts. Daytona officers moved fast. They spotted the car and tried to pull it over, turning what could have been a quiet stop into a rolling line of flashing lights. But inside that Charger, Xavion didn't tap the brakes. He hit the gas. The pursuit that followed wound through Daytona's streets past closed storefronts, scattered tourists, and residents who would only later understand what they'd heard outside their windows. Patrol units fell in behind the Charger, with the Volusia County Sheriff's Office moving in to assist. Sirens cut through the night, bouncing off buildings and the underside of overpasses as the chase pushed closer to the water. It didn't end in some empty parking lot or dead-end cul-de-sac. It ended where the land does, near the Main Street Beach approach. At the edge of Daytona's busy tourist pier, the Charger finally came to a stop. Officers moved in, but before they could open a door, Xavion was out of the vehicle and running. He sprinted toward the Main Street Pier, past the signs and railings built for vacation photos and ocean views, not for fugitives. Above him, the lights from patrol cars painted the boards in red and blue. Ahead of him, the Atlantic opened up in the dark. What makes this part of the story different from so many other pursuits is that Xavion wasn't just being watched by the officers behind him. He was being watched by the internet. Later, Daytona's police chief would confirm that during this flight, Xavion was live streaming on social media.
All law enforcement agencies in the area have been working collaboratively to try to locate the suspect. The Volusia County Sheriff's Office, Ormond Beach PD, Daytona Beach Shores, everybody is aware. We were informed that at some point he was streaming live on social media where he displayed a gun and he made suicidal statements. So I can tell you that no stone is being left unturned as it pertains to doing our best to try to locate the suspect. I was also informed that Alachua County is going to be releasing their own details here shortly, so I don't want to go too much into their investigation.
At some point that night, he pointed his phone at himself, at the road, at the gun he held, and he talked. He talked about what he'd done, about what he thought was coming next, and about not wanting to survive the night. It turned a private spiral into a public performance, thousands of miles of fiber optic cable, carrying the last hours of his life to screens that had no context for the woman lying lifeless back Gainesville. Picture that, a man accused of shooting his girlfriend, barreling through Florida streets with police lights in his rearview mirror, one hand on the wheel and one hand holding a phone, telling an invisible audience he doesn't plan to see the morning. It's the kind of moment that would sound like fiction if it weren't backed by a chief standing in front of microphones saying, yes, this is exactly what he did. The officers on the ground didn't need to watch the stream. They watched him. After ditching the car near the Main Street Beach approach, Xavion ran the length of the pier. The boards under his feet were the same ones kids run across during the day, chasing seagulls and ice cream. That night, they carried a man with a gun and a head full of decisions he couldn't take back. At the far end of the pier, above the sand and the surf, there's a drop that looks smaller when you're standing at the bottom than when you're staring over the edge. According to video footage and police accounts, Xavion climbed or vaulted the railing and jumped. 20 feet doesn't sound like much until you picture your own body falling that distance in the dark, landing on sand that might as well be concrete if you hit it wrong. One officer would later say that kind of fall probably broke a bone, or at least left him seriously hurt. It's the kind of risk people take when they're more afraid of what's behind them than what's below. By the time officers fought their way down from the pier to the beach, there was no suspect in sight. No man in black lying in the sand, no obvious trail staggering away. Just wet footprints, waves rolling in and out, and a night that had swallowed the one person they were supposed to catch. The Atlantic has a way of erasing lines faster than any cleanup crew ever could. The response ramped up instantly. Daytona Beach police and Volusia County deputies saturated the area, boardwalk, pier, beach turning a tourist corridor into a search grid. Patrol units crept along the sand. Officers with flashlights swept under the pier and along the dunes. They called him what he was, armed and dangerous. They told residents and visitors to stay vigilant, to call 911 from a safe distance if they saw a man matching his description. 6'1", medium build, all black clothing, white socks, white sneakers, a face now plastered across local news. Soon after, Chief Jakari Young stepped up to a podium and laid out what they knew. He walked through the timeline. Around 9:52 p.m., law enforcement in Alachua County responds to shots fired and identifies their suspect as Xavion Perry. Around 11:30 p.m., Daytona Beach police get an alert that his car is in their area. A traffic stop is attempted, a pursuit begins, and it ends on the Main Street Beach approach with a jump from the pier.
So at approximately 9:52 p.m., law enforcement in Alachua County responded to shots fired in the area where they located their deceased victim, and it was at that time that they identified their suspect as Xavion Perry. At approximately 11:30 p.m., the Daytona Beach Police Department was alerted through law enforcement technology that Perry was in our area. We attempted a traffic stop on his 2021 black Dodge Charger, at which time he fled, so we engaged in a pursuit. That pursuit ended on the Main Street Beach approach, at which time he fled from the vehicle. He ended up on the pier, and based on what we can tell from video footage, at some point he jumped from the pier back onto the beach, at which time we lost sight of him. So there's been an extensive search going on for Perry throughout the night.
He confirmed that Xavion had a felony grand theft charge and misdemeanor charges for domestic violence and resisting without violence on his record, with no convictions yet. He confirmed that the suspect had been live streaming, showing a gun, making suicidal statements. And then he said the words no coastal community wants to hear. They did not know exactly where he was. He might have stayed in Daytona. He might have slipped out of the area. They weren't going to assume anything. They brought in extra resources, filled the boardwalk with uniforms, and asked the public to help, not by playing hero, but by being eyes and ears and letting officers handle the rest. People who live and work around the pier later talked about seeing officers pour into businesses that night, guns drawn, scanning faces and corners. For a few hours, the place that usually sells funnel cakes, t-shirts, and cheap sunglasses became the backdrop for an active manhunt. Tourists went back to their hotel rooms with stories they hadn't planned on bringing home. Locals looked out at a beach they thought they knew and realized it had just become part of something they'd only ever seen on the news. By dawn, the sky over Daytona Beach looked like any other Florida morning. Soft light on the water, seagulls circling, another day starting. On paper, the situation was simple. Law enforcement had his car, they had his face. They had a record of his criminal history and a clear description of what he'd done in Gainesville and on the pier. What they didn't have was him. If he had slipped into the Atlantic after that 20-foot drop, by choice or by accident, the ocean would decide when, where, and in what condition he turned up again. Until then, the most dangerous man in 2 counties existed as a set of footprints, a car in an impound lot, a live stream frozen on people's phones, and a question hanging over an entire coastline. If you're still here watching this, you're exactly who we make these deep dive cases for. Hit subscribe so you're with us when we break down how this manhunt ended and what it meant for Brooke's family. 2 mornings after the jump from the Main Street Pier, the ocean gave up one of its secrets. Just after 6 a.m., a person walking along the shoreline in Ormond Beach looked out at the water and saw something that didn't belong there. This stretch of sand, roughly 13 miles north of the pier in Daytona, is usually quiet at that hour, waves rolling in, a few early risers out with dogs or coffee. But this morning, near the 305600 block of Ocean Shore Boulevard, the tide had carried a body in and left it on the sand. They called 911. Volusia County deputies and Ormond Beach officers were on scene within minutes. They cordoned off a section of beach that on any other day would have been just another backdrop for vacation photos. Instead, yellow tape went up, tire tracks cut across the sand, and investigators began doing what they do every time the ocean decides to hand something back. Even before the formal identification, there was a working assumption. A man had jumped off a pier during a manhunt 2 nights earlier and vanished into the Atlantic. Now a body had washed ashore well within the range of the currents. They believed they had found Xavion Perry. Later that day, the confirmation came. The sheriff's office publicly identified the body as that of 31-year-old Xavion Marquis Perry III, the same man Gainesville police had named as the suspect in the shooting death of Brooke Elizabeth Smith. The manhunt ended not with handcuffs and a prison transport, but with a zipped bag on a Florida beach. On paper, that closes the case. In reality, it leaves a hole you can't file away. With Xavion dead, there will be no arrest, no arraignment, no jury, no verdict read aloud in a courtroom with Brooke's name attached to it. There will be no day where her family sits on hard benches and hears a judge describe what happened to their daughter in the formal language of the law. No cross-examinations, no victim impact statements, no sentence measured out in years and parole dates. The file will move from active investigation to cleared by suspect's death, and somewhere in a system that prefers checkboxes to grief, the case will be marked complete. For the people who loved Brooke, that completeness is an illusion. Trials are painful, imperfect, and often re-traumatizing, but they do something important. They create a public record. They give families a space where what happened is laid out under oath, where evidence is organized, where someone in a robe says officially that their person mattered enough for the state to speak their name. When a suspect dies before that process starts, the legal system simply steps aside. The burden of carrying the story falls back on the family and the community. In Gainesville, The University of Florida College of Nursing didn't wait for a verdict to speak. They issued a statement mourning Brooke, calling her loss devastating. She wasn't just one more name on a roster. She was a student weeks from graduation, part of a cohort that now has an empty seat in every memory of this semester. The program she was about to finish is built on the idea of showing up for people in crisis. Now, the program itself found one of its own at the center of a crisis it couldn't undo. Friends, classmates, and local organizations took to social media to fill the silence the courts would never break. They posted photos of Brooke smiling in her scrubs, stories about study sessions and shared shifts, and messages reminding everyone that she was a young black woman on the verge of a nursing career, not just a victim in a headline. Posts circulated in Gainesville focus groups and beyond, framing her death clearly as a domestic violence homicide. People used her story to warn others about patterns of control, jealousy, and escalation that can sit unnoticed until they end like this. In comment sections and Reddit threads, details of the case were picked apart, debated, and reshared. Some posts mentioned alleged behavior inside the relationship, claims about what was said, what was done, who hurt whom first. Those accounts come from shock, anger, and grief, but they don't carry the same weight as a sworn statement or an investigative report. In cases like this, there's a hard line that responsible storytelling has to draw. What police and courts confirm is fact. What family, friends, or strangers speculate is just that speculation. Brooke can't defend herself against accusations. She can't correct the record or explain her choices. So anything beyond what investigators have actually confirmed has to be treated as unverified, not woven into the narrative as if it were proven. What is confirmed is already enough to see the pattern. Investigators say Brooke had been trying to end or distance herself from her relationship with Xavion in the period leading up to her death. She was in the process of stepping back, drawing lines, or planning a future that didn't include him. The shooting happened in that context. That is exactly the danger window domestic violence advocates talk about when they say the most dangerous moment is leaving. It's not a metaphor. It's a description of the point where control is threatened and lethal violence often spikes. This isn't just Brooke's pattern. It's one seen in case after case. Someone tries to leave, the controlling partner can't accept it, and a decision is made that turns a private crisis into a permanent loss. That's why when advocates talk about safety, they don't just say walk away. They talk about planning, about timing, about who knows what, about whether there are weapons in the home, about where you can go that your partner doesn't know about. The goal isn't just to leave, it's to live. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself in any part of Brooke's situation, if you're with someone who explodes when you set a boundary, or who has threatened to hurt you, themselves or anyone else if you ever leave, your fear is not overreacting. That knot in your stomach about what might happen if you try to end it is there for a reason. You shouldn't have to calculate your own risk like this, but if you're doing that math, you already know something is wrong. You do not have to do this alone. In the United States, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7. They can help you think through a real plan, where to go, who to tell, what steps to take to reduce danger as much as possible. If you're watching from another country, look up the crisis lines and support services in your area. Talk to someone who understands this pattern and can help you move through it as safely as possible. Telling the right person at the right time can be the difference between a close call and a story someone else has to finish for you. Brooke's story should have had more chapters. She was 23, a nurse in training who had chosen a career built entirely around walking into other people's worst days and trying to make them survivable. The kind of person who would have stood next to a hospital bed, chart in hand, and quietly kept things moving while someone else's world fell apart. Instead, her own worst day ended in the very kind of violence her profession exists to treat. She deserved to make it to graduation, to put on scrubs and clock in for her first shift, to grow old enough to roll her eyes at how hard nursing school felt, compared to everything that came after. She deserved to tell her own story in her own words. None of that is coming now. What we have instead is a cautionary tale that might reach someone in time. If Brooke's story sounded uncomfortably familiar, reach out before your story reaches the point where nobody can rewrite it. And if you want more cases told with this level of care for the victims, their families, and the lessons they leave behind, subscribe to this channel. Some stories don't just inform us. They might literally save someone's life.